So I was literally raised in a barn. My parents were farmers in the countryside, and I grew up helping them with chores for as long as I could remember. Milking the cows, gathering eggs from the chicken coop, carrying hay bales, that sort of thing. We country folk valued the virtue of hard work like that. My parents were the old-fashioned sort, especially my father. He was the kind of man who couldn't tell the difference between corporal punishment and straight-up child abuse over honest mistakes. I wasn't a particularly naughty child, but I was a bit clumsy. One time, I accidentally spilled a bucket of milk during chores, and my father whipped me with a leather belt so hard that I passed out, while my mother only watched sadly from the corner. Eventually, I got tired of the country life with my uncaring family, and moved out of the farm to find a new life for myself in the big city. My parents didn't approve, of course, but it wasn't like they could stop me. As soon as I was 18, I drove out of the farm in my cheapest second-hand car and didn't look back. All I left behind for my parents was a note telling them that I was going to make a new life for myself far away from them. Yeah, I didn't exactly have the best relationship with them. I wouldn't return to the farm again until 15 years later, when I got a knock at the door of my cramped studio apartment. I opened the door thinking that it was odd, since I didn't get many visitors due to always being too busy with my work at a soul-sucking corporate job to make any friends. A middle-aged man in an ill-fitting gray suit stood at my door holding a brown leather briefcase in one hand. My first thought was that he was a door-to-door salesman, trying to sell me something, and immediately felt annoyed. I was still mentally recovering from a whole week of mind-numbing work, and this was supposed to be my day off when I could do whatever I wanted without my manager breathing down my neck. "Look, buddy, whatever you're selling, I'm not interested," I said in an irritable tone. I tried to close the door right afterwards, but felt the door jam when the man placed a boot-clad foot between the door and door frame. "I'm not a salesman, kid," the man said, his voice calm but clearly exhausted. "I'm a private investigator. I need to talk to you about something." Curious, I eased the door back open, but kept my hand on the handle. Why would anyone hire a private investigator to find me? The man's expression turned grim. "It's about your parents," he said in a somber voice. What he said next made me feel like my soul left my body. He explained that my father had died over 3 years ago. My mother, apparently driven mad from grief, was recently admitted to a mental hospital against her will, for her and everyone else's safety. With my father dead and my mother deemed mentally unwell, my mother's lawyer hired a private investigator to find me so that the ownership of the farm could be transferred to me. The next couple of days went by in a blur. After confirming who I was, the private investigator brought my mother's lawyer to me so that I could sign the documents transferring ownership of the old farm to me. I signed wherever he told me to sign, and the two offered me shallow condolences before disappearing from my life forever. It took me another week to gather the courage to go back to that old farm. At the end of it, I called my boss to let him know that I'd be gone for a week. I got into the same busted-up car I'd left the farm in to go back to it, for the first time in over a decade. To say that that place was in bad shape when I got there would be an understatement. Despite all the bad memories I had of that place thanks to my father, it was still my childhood home. It pained me to see it in such a sorry state. Weeds grew over the crop fields that had once been so carefully tended to. The few remaining pigs on the farm were so scrawny and malnourished, it was a miracle they were still alive. Their feed bins were completely empty and collecting dust. It didn't look like anyone's touched them in a long time. I wondered for a moment how they were able to survive without anyone feeding them. Then, I noticed a small group of younger pigs gathered in a corner, loudly eating something buried under all their hungry snouts. I strained my eyes to see what it was, and felt sick to my stomach when I recognized it. They were gathered around the corpse of an old pig, and were eagerly tearing away at its flesh and bone to eat. Without anyone to feed them, the pigs had resorted to cannibalizing each other to survive. I immediately left the barn in disgust to check on the cows instead. They were still grazing the field as usual, but there was one dead cow that had been left to rot, with flies swarming all around them. I couldn't even tell if it had died from old age or was killed by a predator with how desiccated its body had become. After taking a moment to process just how messed up the farm had become, I went to the farmhouse to clear my head, only to find it just as neglected as the rest of the property. Everything was covered in a layer of dust, and cobwebs adorned every dark corner. There was even a tower of dirty dishes in the sink, left to stagnate in fetid gray water. According to the lawyer, my mother had been living on the farm up until her admission to the mental hospital just about a month ago. Yet, it looked like the place had been abandoned for years. I could only assume that she started neglecting it after my father's death. My parents' bedroom was a mess, with clothes strewn about on the floor or haphazardly stuffed into the drawers with no rhyme or reason. Oddly enough, the only place in the entire property that had been well kept was my old bedroom. The place was spotless, save for a few dusty corners. Everything was just as I'd left it, from the metal music poster I hung on the walls as an edgy teenager, to the bookshelf filled with heavy adventure books that I couldn't bring with me. Even the goodbye letter I left on my desk before leaving the farm was still there, though I could see several dried up liquid stains that weren't on it before. I tried hard to convince myself that they weren't my mother's tear stains. Sitting on my perfectly made childhood bed, I realized with a heavy heart that out of all the things in the farm that needed tending to, my mother only ever took care of my room. Deep down, my mother must have really cared for me, even if she was never able to stop my father from beating me as a child. I decided then and there that I would fix the farm up so that it would be in better shape for her to return whenever the doctors deemed her fit for release. I spent the next day cleaning the farmhouse and feeding the pigs in the barn, their first proper feeding for the first time in years. I even cleaned up the cow carcass in the field by burning it on a large pyre. Usually a dead cow would be composted, but I couldn't tell whether it had died from a disease or not, and didn't want to risk creating tainted compost. I sat on a folding chair and watched as the raging fire consumed the carcass with a fire extinguisher on my side and a hunting rifle slung over my back. If the cow had been killed by a wild predator, I wanted to be ready to defend the farm if it returned to kill another cow. I must have watched the fire for about an hour before I caught sight of something in the corner of my eye. The sun had gone down by then, and I was only able to see by the light of the burning pyre. Through the flickering light of the fire, I could only tell that whatever it was approaching me from a distance, enshrouded by the darkness of night. I couldn't make out what it was, but the hazy, shaggy outline made me think that it was some sort of animal. Thinking it was a wolf, I brought up my hunting rifle and shot at the thing. I didn't expect to actually hit it in the darkness. I just wanted to scare it off with the sound of gunfire. But right after I pulled the trigger, I heard the sound of whatever it was yelp in pain, right before collapsing to the ground. But the sound it made wasn't that of an animal. My eyes widened in horror when I recognized it as a human cry. But when I reached it, the horrible truth became clear to me. Lying on the ground with a bullet in her chest was the corpse of an old woman. Her hair was overgrown and shaggy, so much so that I'd mistaken it for the fur of an animal in the dark. The only thing she wore were a light green tunic and matching baggy trousers, the kind you probably see a patient wear at a hospital. After a whole minute of gawking, horrified by what I'd accidentally done, I snapped back to my senses and tried to think of what to do. I should have called the police. It was a genuine accident after all, and the person was technically trespassing on my property. But in my panic and cowardice, the only thing I could think of at that moment was finding a way to get rid of the body. I picked up the woman's body and tossed it into the pyre alongside the cow carcass. For what felt like forever, I watched as both of their bodies were consumed by the flames with sweaty hands, though my body felt frozen in fear. In the end, all that was left were brittle bones that I easily crushed into dust. I slept fitfully that night, scared that someone would come looking for whoever that woman was the next day. My fears came true when I heard a knock on the door the next day as I was eating breakfast. I saw the police car parked outside through the window and thought that things couldn't possibly get any worse. I was wrong. I answered the door and was met with a young police officer. "Good morning, officer," I said in the most normal voice I could muster. "Is something wrong?" "It's about your mother," the officer said. "What about her?" I said in surprise. "She escaped the mental hospital last night. One of the nurses told her that you'd returned to the family farm, and we were wondering if she broke out to visit you here or not." He opened a picture on his phone gallery and showed it to me. "I've been told that you haven't seen her in a while, so you might not recognize her, but this is what she should look like now. Have you seen her?" I looked at the picture and felt my heart nearly stop. Sitting on a hospital bed in the picture was the same woman I'd shot the previous night. That woman I'd accidentally killed and intentionally burned in a pyre alongside a common farm animal was none other than my very own mother. Fighting back the urge to vomit, I told the officer that I hadn't seen her. I couldn't hide all the horror in my voice though. Thinking that I was merely worried about my mother's safety, he assured me that they'd find her soon. There weren't a lot of places to hide in the countryside after all. I thanked him, though I knew nobody would ever find her. I left the farm shortly afterwards to go back to the city. Though I've tried to return to my normal life, my mind kept reminding me of what I'd done, with nightmares of my mother crying, still bleeding from the bullet hole I put in her chest. That was over a decade ago. I'm gonna return to the farm one last time. I can no longer live with this guilt, so I've decided that I won't live at all. I'm bringing my hunting rifle there too, but this time, the only one who will be shot by me is me. Hey guys, I see many of you commenting on my videos that this channel deserves 1 million subscribers. But I also see the percent of people who watch my videos aren't actually subscribed to the channel. So, if you like the content, want to support my channel, and want to see this channel reach 1 million subscribers, or maybe 500,000 subscribers, then go ahead, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. It's free, and you can always change your mind later. I used to love going to amusement parks as a kid. My favorite one was called Wonderwood Park. It had an Alice in Wonderland theme that was just different enough from the House of Mouse's version to not get sued. Since it was close to where I lived, every summer I'd go there with my parents as an annual tradition. Those days gave me some of the happiest memories of my life. They couldn't last though. My father got a job far away from our old town, and we all had to move with him. It became impractical to travel to Wonderwood Park every year, so we eventually just stopped going. I was just about to graduate high school when my mother told me that she heard the park closed down due to unknown reasons. I remember feeling sad when I heard the news, but I was too busy with things like finals and college applications to be too down about it. It was only after I'd graduated college and moved out of my parents' house that I decided to return to my old hometown once more to revisit Wonderwood Park. I pulled over to the nearest hotel and rented a room there before proceeding to where Wonderwood Park once was on foot, wearing a medical mask to cover my face. I doubted anyone actually cared whether people went to those ruins or not, but I was still technically trespassing. It was better if nobody saw me there, and for them to not see my face if they did. Late that afternoon, I hopped over the fence, past the locked gates, and into Wonderwood Park for the first time since I was 12. As expected, a lot has changed since my last time there, but I was still able to recognize it as the place that made my childhood. The rides I had once waited in humongous lines to get on lay rusty and dilapidated from years of neglect. The food stands had completely collapsed, ravaged by the elements and scavenging animals that ate whatever was left behind. Even the towering Ferris wheel that had once been the highlight of my every trip stood deteriorated, with the wheel looking like it could fall off the rickety hinges at any moment. It was a shame to see the source of so many fond memories in such a state, but I couldn't help but feel just a little happy that I was able to return to see it one last time. I took out my phone to take some pictures as a keepsake. I walked around the theme park taking pictures of all the attractions I used to love as a kid. The slingshot ride that was made to look like a heart-shaped guillotine, the water ride based on the time that Alice cried enough tears to cause a flood, and even a winding hedge maze decorated with the now long-dead roses that was supposed to resemble the Queen of Hearts garden. I got a little lost in the last one. I must have passed the same crumbling statue of the Queen of Hearts at least 3 times. Even when covered in bird shit, she still manages to look like a pompous prick. By the time I managed to find my way out of the maze, night was already beginning to fall. I got ready to leave the place before it got too dangerous to walk outside alone. But as soon as I took a step beyond the maze entrance, I heard something that stopped me in my tracks. Psst, hissed a soft voice somewhere behind me. It sounded like the voice of a child. Startled, I spun around to see what it was. Standing with her face half hidden behind a hedge wall was a pale little blonde girl in a tattered-looking blue dress. She stared at me with a pleading eye, but didn't utter a word as I stood there dumbfounded by her presence. Hey, I said, once I got over the initial surprise. What are you doing here? The little girl didn't reply. She just continued to stare at me with that glassy blue eye that seemed to see through my soul. I was a little creeped out, to be honest, but I wasn't about to abandon her there in the ruins. Hey, sweetie, are you lost? I asked. Do you know where your parents are? She didn't reply. She just turned away and ran off behind the hedge wall. Wait! I called out after her. It took me a long time to figure out the hedge maze myself. I didn't want her to get lost in it as well, so I ran after her. I turned the corner just in time to see the blue hem of her dress disappear behind the left hedge wall corner. I ran after her, my footsteps echoing throughout the otherwise silent ruins like banging drums. Each time I turned a corner to find her, I'd only catch a glimpse of her trailing dress, telling me which direction she went in the maze. It was almost as if she was doing it on purpose. Finally, I followed her to the wide open center of the maze, where there were no corners for her to hide behind. She stood stock still in front of the Queen of Hearts statue, with her back to me. It was the same Queen of Hearts statue I'd accidentally passed several times trying to get out. You're not gonna run away again, are you? I said between heavy pants, though the little girl didn't seem tired at all. Please just stay there. I'll call the police. They'll make sure you're safe, okay? I promise. The little girl shook her head, her face still turned away from me. It's too late for that, said the little girl, in the most sorrowful voice I'd ever heard. Before I could ask what she meant, the girl turned around to look at me. For the first time, I was able to fully see her face. It made me immediately wish I hadn't. The left half of her face had been completely torn open. I could see her cracked white skull peering through the bloody gash in her flesh, and her eye was hung from its socket, dangling over her ghostly pale cheeks like a macabre pendulum. I would have screamed had the shock of it all not caused my body to freeze in fear. Without another word, the little girl turned her back to me again and sunk into the dirt in front of the Queen of Hearts statue. It was then that I noticed that the dirt looked like it'd been disturbed. There was a small mound of dirt no bigger than a basketball, hidden by the overgrown grass that surrounded it. I managed to compose myself enough to approach it and examine it closer. Sticking out of the dirt was what looked like a human finger bone, small enough to belong to a child. I immediately called the police. Naturally, they asked me what I was doing in the ruined amusement park in the first place, and detained me for a few days while they investigated the girl's body buried under the Queen of Hearts statue. Thankfully, I was able to get off on minor trespassing charges after it became clear she'd been rotting there for at least 5 years. I don't know if the police will ever find out who put her there. I don't think even she knew herself. I just hope her spirit can finally find peace now, after being trapped in that park for so long. I traveled to find myself after college. It's a tale as old as time. College student graduates with a degree that he has no idea what to actually do with it, and wanders the country by himself in an old car he bought on eBay, hoping that he'll find some profound meaning to life at a pit stop somewhere. For one entire year after graduating, I went on a cross-country road trip going nowhere in particular. I often stopped by small towns and took part in whatever obscure local traditions it had. Pie baking contests, annual dance festivals, weird delicacies anyone else in America would consider disgusting, that sort of thing. Though they were all from the same country, it was interesting to see how different they all were from one another. I enjoyed my time stopping by them, even if I had to do odd jobs every now and then when my savings wouldn't cut it. One day on my self-realizing road trip, I came across a town that would change my life forever. It started out with a rusty old sign behind the road in the middle of nowhere. I would have missed it had I not been driving slower than usual to take in the sight of the vast expanses of wild grass to the either side of me. I parked right beside the sign and had to squint to read what it said through the brown rust that had gathered on it. It read, Rory, 100 miles, accompanied by an arrow curving left. I assumed that Rory must be a small town, and I started to look forward to learning some new local customs. I continued to drive down the long road, keeping an eye out for a left turn. Eventually, I came across a small dirt path branching off the main concrete road into a dense forest. Vegetation had grown over the path, but I could tell that just below the foliage was a smooth paved surface that might have once been used by people. I probably would have missed it entirely had I not been looking for it. The town must have been happy in its isolation to leave the path and it's so hard to find. I turned the car onto the overgrown path and into the forest. Shadows casted by the tall trees above engulfed my vehicle. Only the faint spots of sunlight from the thicket lit my path up enough for me to not accidentally drive into a tree. After about an hour or so of driving over crunchy leaves, I finally reached the end of the path. In front of me was a small town with short, boxy buildings flanking either side of its roads. On the surface, it looked like all the other towns I'd visited since starting my trip, and yet, something about it felt off as I drove through it. I quickly realized what it was. The place was way too quiet. Usually, when I rolled into a new small town, I'd at least get a look or two from a local wondering what the banged-up car was doing in their town. But here, there wasn't even anybody outside doing anything, and I couldn't see anyone in the buildings through the windows either. At that moment, I knew I'd either stumbled into a town full of introverts or an abandoned one. I held out hope that it might just be a quiet day for the town, and drove to a building with a hotel sign in front of it. My car was the only one in the eerily empty parking lot. I pushed open the door to the little hotel. Like the rest of the town, there was no one to be found. The receptionist desk sat empty, and nobody came when I rang the bell on it. I knew at that point that the town must have been abandoned by its residents, though for what reason I still couldn't tell. After only a moment's hesitation, I swiped a key from the key rack behind the receptionist desk and went to the room it was for. While I didn't relish the thought of squatting in an unoccupied building, I was itching for a comfortable bed to lie on after spending the past few nights in my car. The door to the hotel room creaked open with a loud squeak. I looked inside hoping to find a bed to rest on for the night. Although the room seemed well kept enough, I knew I wasn't going to be sleeping on the bed anytime soon when I saw it. Some sort of red mold was staining the white sheets of the bed, and the smell was unbearable too, like roadkill that had been left to rot. I gagged and closed the door before going back to the front desk to get a key for a different room to sleep in. But when I did, I was met with the same exact problem in the new room. The same pungent red mold that had covered the sheets of the first room was on the cushioned chair of the new room I picked. The smell was also just as terrible, and once again, I went back to the front desk to get the key for a different room. I found the same red mold in every single room I entered in the hotel, sometimes on the chairs and sofas. most of the time on the beds. I was about to give up after checking the 10th room when something on the moldy bed caught my eye. Something that glinted in the golden sunlight that shone past the closed curtains. Holding my breath, I approached the bed to see what it was. My eyes widened when I saw a gold diamond ring on top of the red mold. My body moved before I could think twice. I tried to pick up the ring, no longer caring whether I touched the mold or not. The moment my fingertip touched the red mold, I felt a burning pain shoot through it and into my arm. I let go of the ring and took a step back. I suddenly didn't want the ring or to stay in the town anymore. I ran out of the hotel and back into my car. I grabbed the first aid kit I kept in the glove compartment and poured rubbing alcohol over where I'd touched the mold. The moment the alcohol touched my skin, a searing pain erupted in my fingertip. Upon closer inspection, I could see that my fingertip had developed a bloody blister that bulged out of my skin like a bulbous water balloon. I gently poked at it with my other hand, and the blister instantly burst at the slight pressure. The blood from the blister splattered all over my hands. I felt a burning sensation whenever the blood touched my skin. I scrambled to wipe them off with a towel, but realized with horror that they wouldn't come off. The blood had permanently seeped into my skin, turning into reddish sores that looked eerily similar to the red mold I encountered in the hotel. It's been a week since then. I'm still in the town and the sores have spread. Every day I can feel the sores that now cover my arms, eating away at my flesh. My arms are little more than skin and bones now. I'm sure that it'll soon eat at my bones in time as well. I felt a burning sensation whenever the blood touched my skin. I scrambled to wipe them off with a towel, but realized with horror that they wouldn't come off. As I return to the road in search for help, I pray that I have not accidentally doomed the rest of the world to the same fate as that abandoned town.